Morning, everybody. So in this video, we're going to talk about independent contractors or owner-operators and the trucking industry, and how I kind of view it as threading the needle. Um, Many times workers in general are forced to face a binary choice: non-union workplace or a union workplace. And I've worked in both. There's advantages and disadvantages, obviously, pros and cons of each. Um, I've had experience when I was younger of working with the Teamsters Union, and Teamsters Union would be the most relative for the trucking industry. And they're a very good union, very strong. I got a lot of respect for the Teamsters. I wouldn't oppose them. I think their heart is in the right place, to represent, their members. Uh, and a lot of things that companies do have a chilling effect on unions. And so there is this struggle back and forth. Unions are the countermeasure or the counterweight towards abusive non-union companies, is the threat of unionization. And that's very big in the trucking industry. In the 1970s, for example, unions were very, very strong in the trucking industry. There's a strong history there. And it's something that I think when truckers reflect upon, the brotherhood of trucking, that kind of comes from the brotherhood of unions. And the idea with unions is that labor is labor. Your trucking job isn't necessarily much different, if any, than any other person's trucking job. And so, as individuals, it's very hard to ask for pay increases or better benefits or better working conditions. But if the workers combine their efforts, then they can bargain collectively. Then they could say, well, at the block, we represent 1 million truck drivers, for example. That's much more leverage with these corporations than if you're an individual trying to negotiate better working conditions or better pay. So trucking companies that are non-union work very, very hard to remain non-union. And some trucking companies are very good at employee relations. They're very good at offering a 401k match or vacation pay or profit sharing. All these things are designed to reduce turnover for sure, but also to remain union free. And it's it's a it's a problem with labor that the country struggles with. Not every industry struggles with this, and Congress has allowed exemptions for independent contractors in trucking. And part of that is because the unions were very strong. They were very, very strong. They could shut the country down, you know. And you see this type of union strategies, like airlines, for example. When do they go on strike? They do it on the holidays when people want to travel. You know, this is the union exercising or flexing its muscles. It's saying, look, we have to apply pressure in order to get concessions, because companies aren't going to, improve your pay or working conditions or benefits voluntarily. They have to be forced to do it. And this gets to be some very ugly business, right? Nobody likes this. Nobody likes the work stoppage, or the strikes, or the union dues. Guys don't like paying for things that they don't have to. You know, so trucking companies and unions back and forth, all the time. A lot of trucking regulations were put in place by the American Truck Association, which represents the big box carriers, that help promote companies' interests in staying non-union. And part of that is the independent contractor business model. So when you see things like the PRO Act, which is Protect the Right to Organize Act, they come out strongly against independent contractor. And you say, well, why is that? And it's like, well, because from the union's perspective, and I don't think they're wrong, I'll be perfectly clear, they're not necessarily wrong. They they see that as the independent contractor business model as undermining labor. It's like unfair labor practice, unfair labor rule that they want to eliminate. It would be easier for unions to organize trucking companies if there were not independent contractors. And trucking companies say, well, there are drivers that are not happy being company drivers, and we'd rather not have them form unions, so let's help them become small business owners, and then they can still haul our freight as independent contractors. So, this is like a pressure relief valve for the companies. They're like, look, if you're not happy as a company driver, why don't you think about buying your own truck and being a small business owner? And this is kind of like the third option, right? Company drivers can either stay as company drivers, be non-union. They could try to organize and form a union, or the third option would be try to be independent contractors and run a small business. This sounds fine and dandy, but the union would say, well, look, if you want to be an owner operator and you want to run a small business, then go get your own trucking authority and be on the spot market. That's a strong argument. That's a very strong argument. And I'm not here to say what the answer is. I'm just trying to highlight what some of these issues are. And to me, the independent contractor business model is kind of like threading the needle. It's a small part of the trucking industry. Should it be allowed? Should it not be allowed? If it depends on where you stand in the industry. What's your perspective? If you were on the spot market, for example, you may say, well, the independent contractor should not exist. We're competing against so-called owner-operators who they're misclassified as, misclassified employees. And they would like to see the independent contractor business model go away, and then those drivers return to being company drivers. But what the guys on the spot market fail to realize is that not all those owner-operators are going to come back to being owner-operators. A percentage of those, and who knows what percent, but let's just say half, we'll just split it down the middle. Half of them go back to being company drivers. Half of them go get their own authority, and now they're on the spot market. So rather than eliminating competition, they've increased their competition on the spot market. So those guys who are on the spot market are wishing that independent contractor business model goes away, actually could be shooting themselves in the foot, because now they're going to have more competition on the spot market. So, then the unions, they're like, well, we don't want the competition either, so let's eliminate the independent contractor business model. And if those guys want to be owner operators, let them go on the spot market. That's what the spot market's there for. You want to run your own company, then do that. I think sometimes the trucking industry, they make rules and regulations to tamp down on competition. So even if you wanted to go and get your own authority, the rules and regulations are immense. Just trying to comply with all the red tape, and the taxes and IFTA and everything. I mean, it's very cost prohibitive. So you could say, lofty things like, oh, go get your own authority. Well, the startup cost of getting your own authority could be, by the time you pay for insurance, and get reliable equipment, I mean, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars. It's kind of cost prohibitive. There's a barrier there you're going to have to cross in order, to get into, the spot market. So Congress has stepped in and has encouraged companies to provide opportunities for drivers to achieve the quote unquote American dream. To give them an opportunity to uh, participate in the trucking industry by having their own small business. So Congress created and Congress allowed the independent contractor business model to exist. Because obviously there was this small segment of the trucking industry that couldn't be filled by unions or by companies or by the spot market. So this is where, you know, the idea of threading the needle comes into play. It's like, is it a perfect solution? I don't think anybody knows. I don't think anybody knows what the perfect solution is. It's a solution to a problem. May not be the best solution, but Congress created these rules and we all have to live by them. And even when you look at rules like California AB5, which tries to, prevent truckers from being independent contractors, the Supreme Court had ruled in and said, you could do that in California, but you can't implement it nationwide. It's a state issue. So if California wants to, shoot themselves in the foot by eliminating independent contractors, then California is allowed to do that. And as you can see, a lot of things that California does, the rest of the country doesn't want to do. So, but there are other states like New Jersey or Illinois, some of the deep blue states, Washington, Oregon, they look at California and they copy what California does. So they may come out with more and more restrictions on the independent contractor business model. Other states like Texas says, no, we need to give people freedom of choice. If you want to form a union, form a union. If you want to stay non-union, stay non-union. If you want to go to the spot market, go on the spot market. If you want to become an independent contractor, then go for it. People need freedom, freedom to choose, what works best for them. So I put, a lot of thought into the independent contractor business model, and I would prefer to be an independent contractor than to be an employee, as many independent contractors would agree. More flexibility, a little better pay, a little more control over your work assignments, you purchase your own equipment. There's a lot of benefits to being an independent contractor. There's a lot of benefits of being in a union too. And would there ever come a time where the drivers in the industry, are so fed up with, the working conditions that unions could regain some of their membership back? It's possible. Anything's possible. Let's say, for example, there could be some hot button issues, for example, that just motivates drivers towards the unions. It's like, say, inward facing cameras. That could be a very hot button issue that if these corporations aren't careful, they're going to drive workers into the arms of the Teamsters. And the Teamsters would welcome them, and companies ask for it. There's a saying in the business world that companies that have a union deserve a union. I mean, they had to work hard to get that union in place. They were so poorly mismanaged that the workers felt like the union was their best choice. But the unions aren't immune from criticism either. We look at Yellow Freight, for example. In recent years, they went bankrupt, and there's a lot of finger pointing going back and forth with management and the local Teamsters union. There was a lack of cooperation between the two, and a lot of distrust. And you look at CEO pay, for example, it's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. Hundreds of millions of dollars a year in salary for the CEO. Meanwhile, you have uh, really poor working conditions, for the truck drivers. So these types of issues would drive the workers towards a union. Because individually they can't do much about the industry, can't do much about their workplace or working conditions. But, if you look at the history of labor in the country, you know, Congress put in legislation, they approved it, you know, hundreds of years ago, um, that workers have the right to form unions and bargain collectively as a counterweight to the abuses of corporations. So there is a mechanism there. If the industry really, if the drivers in the industry really have reached their limit, there is a mechanism there for them to affect change. Will they ever do it? I don't know. Because companies work extraordinarily hard at trying to stay non-union, and part of that non-union strategy is to allow independent contractors. If you had a disgruntled employee, what better way to stay non-union than to have the option of them becoming an independent contractor? So this is where the unions want to eliminate the independent contractor model. They're like, look, we can't allow these escape hatches. We gotta keep these disgruntled employees, as employees. Otherwise, we'll never be able to organize them. They're not wrong. They're not wrong about that. Um, but I think when Congress, this is obviously a complex issue that only Congress can address. And when Congress looks at the trucking industry, they're like, look, we can't have this work stoppage. Can't shut down the country. We can't have prices so high that people can't, afford to purchase the products you're hauling. So, Congress allows these exemptions, like the independent contractor. And it's a lot of these things is like, what do you expect the average person to do? We gotta work within the legal framework that Congress has established. And if it's allowed by Congress to form independent contractors, then, are you foolish not to become an independent contractor? I mean, are you so ideologically driven towards unions and union workforce that, you're not going to take advantage of a program that Congress allowed? So this is like corporations. You could complain about corporations not paying taxes, but if Congress created a loophole, corporations have to compete, and they have to compete with each other. And if there's a loophole, they take advantage of it. They got to do it, whether they agree ideologically or not. Because if they don't do it and their competition does, their competition's going to win. So I don't think there's an easy answer to the problems that plague the trucking industry. I think independent contractors play an important part. Um, should it be allowed? Should it not be allowed? These are things that have to be debated in the halls of Congress. You know, um, Oftentimes politics follows public opinion. So let's say, for example, the drivers within the industry prefer a union workforce. Then Congress would follow. But as long as drivers are migrating towards independent contractor business model, then Congress says, well, there's no problem because the drivers are free to choose what the best solution is for their needs. So then they wipe their hands of it. So either way, I mean, I think personally I would adapt to either or. I mean, if the unions can provide better working conditions, better pay, and drivers don't feel the need to to take on the risk of being a small business owner, then, great, but short of having a union workforce, you know, independent contractor is probably the next best thing, if not slightly better than being in a union workforce. So these issues are hotly debated, and I don't think anybody has the answer. It depends on the individual and what's best for you. Individual freedom seems to be the answer in a lot of these debates. It's like, well, is it right or is it wrong? It's like, why don't you let the people be free to choose what they want to do? If they want to join the union, they can join the union. If they don't, they don't. If they want to have their own small business, they have their own small business. So no easy answers. And then technology comes into play. Driverless trucks. Maybe technology will just eliminate truck drivers altogether. Who knows? All right, guys. That's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.